My beloved child, your soulmate is saying, I just found out why you really left, and I can't stop crying. I thought I understood your departure. I built an entire story around it. I told myself you stopped caring. I convinced myself that maybe you had found someone else, maybe your feelings had changed, maybe I simply wasn't enough for you anymore. But today, something happened that shattered every explanation I had been holding on to. I discovered the part of your story I never knew. And suddenly, every unanswered message, every quiet moment, every time you looked at me and then looked away, every strange distance between us started making sense. I keep replaying those moments because I finally understand that your silence was saying something I was too distracted to hear. You weren't simply walking away from me. You were carrying something you didn't know how to explain. And the most painful part is this. I was so focused on how much your leaving hurt me that I never stopped to ask what it cost you to leave. I never imagined that the person I accused of abandoning me might have been the person struggling hardest to stay. There is one memory I can't escape tonight. It was the last time I saw you before everything changed. I remember your expression. I remember the pause before you turned away. I remember how badly I wanted to ask you what was happening, but something inside me told me to wait. I thought there would be another chance. I thought we had more time. Now I wish I had asked one simple question: what are you really going through? Because if I had known then what I know now, I would have understood your goodbye completely differently. And then came the discovery that changed everything. I found out that there was a reason behind the distance, but it wasn't the reason I had imagined. Someone had told me a version of what happened, and I believed it because it was easier than facing the possibility that I might have misunderstood you. I believed the explanation that made you look cold, because that explanation allowed me to protect my own heart. But the truth was sitting somewhere underneath all of it, waiting for me to finally notice the details. I started connecting the little things you had said months ago. One sentence. One strange reaction. One moment when you almost told me something and suddenly stopped. One time when you seemed like you desperately wanted me to understand you without actually knowing how to explain yourself. And now I realize something that hurts more than I expected: you were giving me clues, and I wasn't listening. You were trying to protect something inside yourself while I was interpreting your protection as rejection. I thought your silence meant you didn't care. Maybe it meant you cared too much and didn't know what to do with everything you were feeling. I thought your distance meant you had moved on. Maybe you were trying to create space because being close to me was making a decision inside your heart impossible. And when I finally discovered this, I sat there staring at my screen for what felt like forever. I wanted to reach out immediately. I wanted to ask you why you never told me. I wanted to demand an explanation. But then another thought stopped me completely: maybe you had tried. Maybe I simply wasn't emotionally ready to hear it. That realization broke something open inside me. Because suddenly, I wasn't crying because you left. I was crying because I finally understood why. There is another truth I need you to hear, because this is the part one never expected to admit: I was wrong about you. I was wrong when I assumed your silence was indifference. I was wrong when I convinced myself that you had forgotten me. I was wrong when I looked at the distance between us and decided it meant the connection meant nothing to you. You had every opportunity to make me believe you were unaffected, yet there were signs that you weren't. And now I'm wondering how many nights you spent pretending you were okay while I was doing the exact same thing. Maybe we were both waiting for the other person to make the first move. Maybe we were both afraid that reaching out would expose feelings we had worked so hard to hide. But there is one detail I discovered that keeps returning to my mind. It made me realize that your leaving wasn't the ending I thought it was. It was a reaction to something much deeper. And I'm not ready to tell you the entire story yet, because there is a missing piece that changes the meaning of everything that happened afterward. I need you to understand why I am emotional before I reveal it. You thought I was crying because I missed you. That's only part of it. I'm crying because I finally see how easily we could have avoided losing so much time if I had understood you sooner. I keep thinking about what I would say if you were standing in front of me right now. I wouldn't accuse you. I wouldn't ask why you disappeared. I wouldn't even ask why you left. I would look directly at you and say, I understand now. And maybe those 3 words would be more powerful than every message we never sent. But there's something I haven't told you yet, and this is the part that keeps my heart from settling down. When I discovered the real reason you left, I also discovered something about myself that I had been avoiding for far too long. I realized that I didn't just miss you. I never truly stopped caring about you. I buried it under pride, assumptions, distractions, and the belief that moving forward meant pretending the past no longer mattered. But one discovery brought all of it back at once. Suddenly, your name felt different. The memories felt different. Even the moments I once considered painful began looking like pieces of a story I had misunderstood. And now I have one question that I'm almost afraid to ask: if I had known the truth back then, would you still have walked away? Or would I have finally understood what you were trying to say without words? Because I'm beginning to believe that the moment you left wasn't the moment you stopped loving or caring. It may have been the moment you decided you couldn't keep carrying everything alone. And if that is true, then I owe you more than an apology. I owe you honesty. There is a reason I'm saying this now instead of before. There is something I discovered after you left that connects directly to the final moment we shared. And once you understand what happened in that moment, you may finally see why I've been unable to stop crying tonight. I thought I was mourning what we lost. But now I'm wondering if I've been mourning something else entirely, the time we could have had if we had only known the truth sooner. There was one detail I kept overlooking, and now it feels impossible to believe I missed it for so long. After you left, I replayed our final conversations again and again, searching for the exact moment when everything changed. At first, I thought the answer would be obvious. I expected to find one sentence, one argument, one mistake that explained everything. Instead, I found something much quieter. I noticed how often you were trying to explain yourself without actually saying what was hurting you. You would begin a conversation, hesitate, change the subject, and then pretend everything was normal. I remember those moments differently now. Back then, I thought you were being distant. Now I wonder if you were waiting for me to notice what you couldn't bring yourself to say. And that realization has been sitting heavily on my heart because I finally understand that leaving wasn't necessarily about wanting to escape me. Maybe you were trying to escape the version of yourself that had become exhausted from pretending everything was fine. I wish I had recognized that. I wish I had looked beyond your words and noticed your silence. Because there is a difference between someone who doesn't care and someone who cares deeply but doesn't know how to remain in a situation that keeps overwhelming their heart. You may have thought I didn't notice your struggle, but I noticed more than I ever admitted. I just interpreted it incorrectly. And now I'm realizing that some of the moments I considered proof that you were moving away from me may have actually been proof that you were fighting something inside yourself. That is why I can't stop thinking about you tonight. The story I believed is collapsing, piece by piece, and underneath it is a completely different story, one where your leaving suddenly makes sense. Then I discovered something that made me sit completely still. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some impossible coincidence. It was simply information I should have known much earlier, and once I understood it, every unanswered question became heavier. I realized you had been making decisions based on what you believed I wanted, while I had been making decisions based on what I believed you wanted. Think about that for a moment. Two people caring about each other, both trying not to get hurt, both reading between the lines, both waiting for clarity, and both accidentally creating more distance. You may have thought I was letting you go because I didn't care enough to fight for you. I may have thought you were leaving because you didn't care enough to stay. And somewhere between those two assumptions, we lost the chance to say what was actually inside our hearts. That realization changed the way I remember everything. The silence doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels unfinished. The goodbye doesn't feel final anymore. It feels like a conversation that ended before the most important sentence was spoken. And there is one particular sentence I wish I could go back and tell you: you never had to hide how much this mattered to you. Maybe you were waiting for me to say that. Maybe I was waiting for you to say it first. Either way, we were both waiting, and time kept moving. I'm not saying this to rewrite the past or pretend everything was perfect. It wasn't. There were misunderstandings. There were moments when we both made mistakes. But I'm finally seeing that the distance between us wasn't created by one single moment. It was built from dozens of tiny misunderstandings that neither of us stopped long enough to correct. And now there's something I need to admit that I have resisted for a long time. I kept telling myself that if you truly wanted me in your life, you would have found a way to stay. That thought helped me survive the uncertainty. It gave me a simple explanation. But the more I understand, the less comfortable that explanation feels. Because staying isn't always as simple as wanting to stay. Sometimes someone can care deeply and still believe that leaving is the only way to regain clarity. Sometimes someone can miss you every day and still choose silence because they're afraid that returning without understanding themselves will only create another painful cycle. And maybe that was you. Maybe you weren't trying to erase me. Maybe you were trying to understand what you actually needed before coming back into my world. I wish I had known that then. I would have looked at your distance differently. I would have stopped interpreting every quiet moment as rejection. I would have given you space without turning that space into a story about my own worth. Because that is another thing I discovered. Your leaving was never proof that I wasn't enough. It was proof that something between us had become complicated enough that neither of us knew how to handle it properly. And somehow, understanding that has brought both sadness and relief. Sadness because we lost time. Relief because maybe the connection wasn't meaningless after all. Maybe what we felt was real, but our timing, communication, and fears got in the way. I keep wondering what would happen if we ever sat down without pride, without assumptions, without trying to win an argument. What would you tell me? What would I finally tell you? And most importantly, would we recognize each other again beneath all the things we misunderstood? But the deepest part of this discovery is still ahead, because there is one memory that has suddenly become impossible for me to ignore. It happened shortly before you left. At the time, I thought it was ordinary. Now I realize it may have been the moment when you were silently asking me for something you never knew how to request. I remember your eyes. I remember the hesitation. I remember how you seemed to be waiting for me to say something, anything, that could reassure you. And I didn't. I thought giving you space was the mature thing to do. You may have interpreted that space as confirmation that I didn't care. That possibility hurts more than I can explain. Because if I had understood what you were actually feeling, maybe the entire direction of our story would have changed. And this is why I've been crying, not because I want to pull you backward, not because I want to force the past to become something it wasn't, but because I finally understand how much was left unsaid. There are conversations that end with words, and there are conversations that end because two people become too afraid to speak. Ours may have been the second kind. And now I know the reason you really left wasn't nearly as simple as I once believed. But there's still one final piece I haven't connected, one thing I discovered that explains why your face appeared in my mind immediately after I learned the truth. It changes the meaning of the last goodbye. It changes what I thought you were feeling. And when I finally understood that one missing piece, I realized something I never expected to admit. Maybe the person I thought was walking away from me was actually hoping, somewhere inside, that I would finally understand why. What happened next made me question every conclusion I had reached about you. I found myself going back through the smallest details. The pauses, the unfinished conversations, the moments when you seemed ready to say something important but suddenly became quiet. And then I realized something I had never allowed myself to consider. Maybe your silence was not an absence of emotion, maybe it was emotion you simply didn't know how to express. That changed everything for me. I had spent so much time asking, "Why did you leave?" that I never asked the deeper question, what were you carrying when you left? The difference between those two questions is enormous. One looks for blame. The other looks for understanding. And now, when I think about the last time we were together, I don't remember only the goodbye anymore. I remember the person standing in front of me, trying to stay composed while something inside was clearly unsettled. I remember how quickly you changed the subject whenever the conversation became too personal. I remember the strange calmness in your voice, the kind of calmness that sometimes hides the loudest emotions. At the time, I thought you had already made peace with leaving. Now I wonder if you were trying to convince yourself that leaving was the right decision. And that possibility has completely changed the way I see you. You weren't necessarily choosing a life without me because you stopped caring. Maybe you were choosing distance because you believed staying would make everything even more complicated. I wish I could go back to that exact moment, not to change your decision, but to give you permission to be honest. I would tell you that you didn't have to pretend. You didn't have to make yourself look stronger than you felt. You didn't have to hide behind silence just to protect either of us. Because now I understand that sometimes the person who walks away is carrying the heaviest version of the goodbye. Then something else became clear, and this is where the story became even more emotional for me. I realized that we were both protecting ourselves in completely different ways. You protected yourself by creating distance. I protected myself by pretending I didn't need answers. You became quieter. I became more guarded. You waited for a sign that I still cared. I waited for a sign that you wanted me to stay. And every time neither of us made the first move, the misunderstanding became stronger. It was almost as if we were having an entire conversation without speaking, and somehow both of us were hearing the wrong message. You may have looked at my silence and thought, they've moved on. I looked at yours and thought the exact same thing. That is the part that hurts. Not because either of us intended to hurt the other, but because neither of us understood what the other person was actually trying to communicate. And when I finally realized that, I stopped feeling angry. I started feeling emotional in a completely different way. I began thinking about how many times you might have wanted to reach out but stopped yourself. How many times you might have opened a message and closed it without sending anything. How many times you might have wondered whether I still remembered you. I don't know the answers to those questions, and I won't pretend that I do. But I know what happened inside me when I realized our story may have been shaped more by assumptions than by truth. It made me wonder whether the connection we had deserved one honest conversation before either of us decided what it meant. Maybe that conversation is what we were both missing all along. Not another promise. Not another dramatic moment. Just honesty. The kind of honesty that doesn't demand anything from the other person, but finally allows both hearts to stop guessing. And there is one thought that keeps returning to me tonight. Perhaps I misunderstood the meaning of your final goodbye. I thought you were closing a door. But maybe you were simply stepping away because you didn't know how to keep standing in front of that door while feeling everything you were feeling. That doesn't automatically make the past perfect. It doesn't erase the hurt or make every decision right. But it gives the story another dimension. I can finally see that there were emotions beneath your actions that I never understood. And I can finally admit that there were emotions beneath mine that I never explained either. I wanted you to know I cared without having to say it. I expected you to understand what I meant from the way I behaved. Maybe you were doing the same thing. Maybe both of us expected the other person to read a language neither of us had learned to speak properly. And that realization is humbling. Because I spent so long thinking I was waiting for you to explain yourself, when perhaps you were waiting for me to stop assuming and simply ask. So if you could hear me right now, I wouldn't tell you that everything will magically become perfect. I wouldn't pretend the past never happened. I would simply say this: I understand more now than I did then. I understand why your distance confused me. I understand why my silence may have confused you. And most importantly, I understand that leaving and not caring are not always the same thing. Sometimes people leave because they don't know how to stay without losing themselves in the process. Sometimes they need distance to understand what closeness was doing to their heart. And sometimes, after enough time passes, they finally become brave enough to look back and admit what they couldn't say before. But just when I thought I had finally understood the whole story, I discovered one final detail, and that detail made me stop completely. It was connected to something you said long ago, something so small that I almost ignored it. Yet when I looked at it again with everything I now knew, the meaning felt completely different. Suddenly, your words didn't sound like someone who had stopped caring. They sounded like someone who was afraid of making the wrong choice. And that distinction matters more than you realize. Because if you left while believing that staying would only create more confusion, then maybe what you needed was not another argument or another explanation. Maybe you needed time to see whether what you felt was temporary or whether it remained even after the distance. And now, after everything that has happened, I'm beginning to understand why your absence never felt completely empty. There was always something unfinished between us. Something neither of us had the courage to name. And perhaps that is why the discovery affected me so deeply. I didn't cry because I suddenly believed the past would return exactly as it was. I cried because I finally understood the person behind the decision. I finally saw that there may have been a heart behind your silence that was hurting just as much as mine. And now I'm left with one question that I can't escape. If you really left because of everything I have just discovered, then what were you hoping I would understand before you walked away? Because I have a feeling the answer to that question is the part of our story neither of us has ever truly faced.